Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight we're going to talk about Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking warrior and king, whose story begins not in the halls of power, but in the mists of the north, where history and legend blur together like fog over cold water, and where a farmer's son would rise to become one of the most famous names the Viking Age would ever know. To understand Ragnar Lothbrok, we must first understand the world that shaped him. This was the late 8th and early 9th century, a time when the lands we now call Scandinavia were home to people the rest of Europe would come to call Vikings. They called themselves Norse, or simply the people of the north, and they lived in a landscape of fjords and forests, mountains, and bitter winters, a land that demanded strength from those who would survive it. The Norse world was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of territories, each ruled by jarls and petty kings whose power rose and fell like tides. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden existed more as collections of regions than unified nations, places where loyalty was given to individual leaders rather than to abstract concepts of country or crown. A strong jarl with enough warriors and enough silver could carve out a domain for himself, holding it as long as his strength and reputation lasted. Life in this world revolved around two seasons. There was the farming season, when men worked the land, tended livestock, and prepared for the coming cold. And there was the raiding season, when those same men became warriors, taking to their ships and seeking wealth and glory across the seas. This duality defined Norse culture. A man could be both farmer and fighter, both family provider and fearsome raider, and there was no contradiction in this. Both roles were necessary, both honored. The Norse believed in a complex pantheon of gods who were themselves warriors and wanderers. Odin, the All-Father, was god of wisdom and war, a seeker of knowledge who had sacrificed his own eye for understanding. Thor wielded his hammer against giants and protected the world of men. Freya presided over love and battle both, for the Norse saw no separation between passion and violence. These gods were not distant or abstract, but present, involved in the world, capable of appearing to mortals, capable of fathering children on human women. The Norse understanding of fate was equally complex. They believed in Weird, the concept that each person's destiny was woven by the Norns, three mysterious beings who sat at the base of the world tree and spun the threads of every life. Yet within this framework of predestination, there was also the belief that a person's actions mattered, that courage and cunning could shape outcomes, that a clever man might navigate even a doomed fate with such skill that his death became a victory. Honor meant everything in this culture. A man's reputation, his name, was more valuable than his life. To die with honor in battle ensured a place in Valhalla, Odin's hall, where warriors feasted and fought until the end of the world. To die of sickness or old age was called a straw death, dying in bed, and it carried no such promise. Better to live briefly and be remembered than to live long and be forgotten. The ships that would make the Vikings famous were marvels of engineering, long and sleek, shallow-drafted enough to navigate rivers, but seaworthy enough to cross oceans. A good ship was a jarl's most valuable possession, treated with the same respect as a living creature, given a name and identity. These vessels opened up the world, allowing the Norse to range far beyond their cold homelands, to discover new lands, to raid wealthy monasteries and cities, to establish trade routes that stretched from Baghdad to Newfoundland. In this world, in the late 700s, somewhere in the lands that would become Denmark, a boy was born who would come to embody everything the Vikings represented. His name was Ragnar, and the stories say he was descended from the god Odin himself. That divine blood ran in his veins, though this may have been a claim made later when his fame had spread and every great man needed a divine ancestor to explain his greatness. The historical truth of Ragnar Lothbrok is almost impossible to separate from legend. He appears in multiple sagas, written down centuries after the events they describe, and in each telling his story is slightly different. Some scholars believe he was a real person whose deeds were embellished over time. Others think he might be a composite, multiple historical figures merged into one legendary character. Still others argue that he was always a legend, a story the Norse told themselves about the perfect Viking, the ideal warrior king. What we can say with some certainty is that the name Ragnar Lothbrok, or Ragnar Hairy Breeches, appears in multiple sources from the Viking Age and shortly after. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions a Ragnar, though not by that exact name. The Frankish annals record raids led by a chieftain called Reginheri, who matches some elements of Ragnar's story. Irish sources speak of a fearsome Viking leader active in the mid-9th century. Something happened, someone existed, around whom these stories accumulated like snow, building into an avalanche. The sagas that tell Ragnar's story were written by Icelanders in the 13th century, 400 years after the events they describe. They drew on older poems, on oral traditions, on half-remembered histories and complete fabrications, weaving together a narrative that felt true even when it departed from historical fact. To the saga writers, literal truth mattered less than the deeper truth of character, the essential nature of what it meant to be a great Viking leader. In these sagas, Ragnar is presented as the ideal Norse hero. He is brave and clever, ambitious and ruthless, devoted to his family, yet willing to leave them for years at a time. He seeks fame above all else, understanding that in a culture without writing, a man's only immortality lay in the stories told about him after his death. He is guided by prophecy and fate, yet he makes his own choices, navigating the narrow space between destiny and free will. The world that produced Ragnar Lothbrok was violent and beautiful, brutal and sophisticated, a place where poetry mattered as much as swordsmanship, where clever words could be as deadly as axes, where a farmer might become a king if he had the courage and cunning to seize his opportunity. It was a world in transition, beginning to reach outward, to collide with the broader European civilization, to change and be changed by those collisions. Into this world came Ragnar, whether as history or legend, or some combination of both, and his story would come to define how people remembered the Viking Age, how they understood those fearsome raiders from the north who appeared suddenly from the sea, who took what they wanted and vanished again into the mists, leaving behind only the memory of their passing and the names of their greatest leaders. The sagas tell us that Ragnar was born the son of Sigurd Ring, a king who ruled over parts of Sweden and Denmark. Sigurd Ring was himself a formidable warrior, a man who had won his kingdom through battle, who had united disparate territories through strength and strategy. He was old when Ragnar was born, already a figure of legend, and the boy grew up in the shadow of his father's reputation, knowing that great things would be expected of him. Ragnar's childhood, as the sagas describe it, was spent learning the skills every Norse warrior needed. He learned to handle weapons from an early age, starting with wooden practice swords and graduating to real blades as he grew. He learned to fight with sword and axe, with spear and shield, understanding that a warrior needed to be versatile, able to adapt to different situations and opponents. The training was constant and often brutal, for the Norse did not coddle their children, believing that hardship built character. But warfare was not the only education Ragnar received. He learned the arts of navigation and seamanship, understanding that a Viking who could not handle a ship was only half a warrior. He learned about the stars and how to read them, about currents and winds, about the subtle signs that indicated land was near, even when it could not yet be seen. These skills would serve him throughout his life, allowing him to range far beyond the familiar waters of Scandinavia. He learned poetry and the ancient stories of his people. The Norse placed great value on the ability to compose verses, to speak well, to remember the deeds of ancestors and heroes. A man who could not tell a good story or compose a clever poem was considered lacking in wisdom, no matter how strong his sword arm. Ragnar showed aptitude in this area, demonstrating a quick wit and a facility with words that would become part of his legend. As Ragnar grew into adolescence, he began to display the qualities that would define his later life. He was ambitious, always seeking to prove himself, never content to rest on his father's reputation. He was clever, preferring cunning to brute force when cunning would serve, and he was fearless, not in the sense of feeling no fear, but in the sense of acting despite fear, pushing forward even when caution might have been wiser. When Sigurd Ring died, the question of succession arose. Ragnar had older half-brothers, sons of Sigurd's earlier marriages, and not all of them were willing to step aside for this younger son. The details are unclear in the sagas, deliberately so perhaps, but what emerges is that Ragnar had to fight for his inheritance. He was not simply handed a kingdom, but had to prove himself worthy of it, had to demonstrate that he possessed the strength and cunning to rule. During this period, Ragnar made a name for himself through a series of campaigns and raids. He gathered followers, young men attracted by his confidence and his promise of wealth and glory. He led them on expeditions across the Baltic, raiding settlements, fighting rival jarls, slowly building his reputation. Each successful raid brought more warriors to his banner, for success bred success, and men wanted to follow a leader who seemed touched by fortune. It was during these early years that Ragnar acquired the name Lothbrok, which means hairy breeches or shaggy trousers. The origin of this nickname is explained in one of the more fantastical stories from the sagas, a tale that illustrates how myth and reality intertwine in Ragnar's legend. According to this story, Ragnar heard of a beautiful maiden named Thora, daughter of a Swedish jarl. She kept as a pet a small serpent, which she fed pieces of meat. But the serpent grew with alarming speed, becoming first a large snake, then an enormous creature that coiled around her dwelling, so large that it could bite its own tail. The serpent became dangerous, and Thora's father declared that whoever could kill the creature would win his daughter's hand in marriage. Ragnar wanted to prove himself and win this bride. He prepared for the battle by having a unique set of clothing made, trousers and a cloak made of shaggy hide boiled in pitch, creating a thick, protective layer. Thus armored, he confronted the serpent, fighting it with spear and sword, protected from its venomous bites by his strange garments. He killed the creature, won Thora's hand, and gained the nickname Lothbrok from the unusual trousers he had worn in battle. Whether this story has any basis in historical fact is impossible to say. It reads like myth, like the kind of tale Norse storytellers loved, mixing the plausible with the fantastic, giving their hero a dramatic origin story. What matters isn't whether Ragnar actually fought a giant serpent, but that people believed he might have, that his reputation was such that extraordinary deeds seemed possible, even likely. Ragnar married Thora, and the sagas tell us she bore him 2 sons, Eirik and Agnar. These were his first children, the beginning of a dynasty that would spread across Scandinavia and beyond. Ragnar was a devoted father, as devoted as a Viking warlord could be, teaching his sons the same skills he had learned, preparing them to inherit his reputation and his ambitions. But Thora's time in the story is brief. She died young, from illness, the sagas say, leaving Ragnar a widower with 2 young sons. Her death was a blow to him, though he did not show his grief openly, for Norse culture valued stoicism, the ability to endure loss without complaint. He mourned in private and turned his attention to the work of building his power, understanding that a jarl who showed weakness risked losing everything he had built. In the years following Thora's death, Ragnar's reputation continued to grow. He was still young, not yet 30, but already he was known across Scandinavia as a formidable warrior and a clever leader. Men spoke of his raids with admiration, of his ability to strike where he was least expected, to win victories against superior numbers through cunning and courage. He was becoming the kind of leader that the sagas celebrated, the kind of man whose name would be remembered. But Ragnar's ambitions reached beyond Scandinavia. He had heard stories of the rich lands to the south and west, of kingdoms where monasteries held vast treasures, where cities were wealthy and relatively undefended, where a bold leader with a fleet of ships could win enormous riches and undying fame. He began to look beyond the familiar waters of the Baltic, to dream of expeditions that would take him to the very heart of Christian Europe, to places no Norse raider had yet penetrated. The stage was set for Ragnar to become more than just another successful Viking leader. He had the skills, the ambition, and the reputation. What he needed now were opportunities, moments when fate and preparation would intersect, allowing him to accomplish deeds that would echo through history. Those opportunities were coming, though he could not yet know it, carried on currents that were bringing the Viking Age to its height, that were opening the world to Norse ambition and Norse violence. It was after Thora's death that Ragnar encountered the woman who would become his second wife and perhaps his greatest love. Her name was Lagartha, and she was no ordinary woman. She was a shield maiden, a warrior in her own right, a figure who embodied the Norse belief that courage wasn't limited by gender, that a woman with the strength and will could take up arms and fight alongside men. The circumstances of their meeting, as told in the sagas, were dramatic. Ragnar had travelled to Norway, where a local tyrant had killed a jarl and imprisoned the jarl's female relatives, intending to force them into a brothel. When Ragnar heard of this injustice, he gathered warriors and attacked the tyrant's stronghold, intending to free the captive women and avenge the murdered jarl. The battle was fierce, and to Ragnar's surprise, some of the women did not wait to be rescued, but took up weapons themselves and joined the fighting. Among them was Lagartha, who fought with such skill and ferocity that Ragnar noticed her even in the chaos of combat. She wielded her weapons with the precision of a trained warrior, showing no fear, moving through the battle like someone born to it. After the victory, Ragnar sought her out. He was drawn not just to her beauty, but to her strength, to the fire he saw in her. This was a woman who could understand him, who could match him, who would not simply wait at home while he sought glory. He proposed marriage, but Lagartha was not easily won. She set a test for him, placing a bear and a dog at her dwelling to guard her, telling him that if he could defeat these animals, she would know he was worthy. Ragnar killed the bear and the dog, demonstrating the courage and strength that Lagartha required. They were married, and she bore him a son named Fridleif and 2 daughters whose names the sagas do not preserve with certainty. For a time they lived together, Ragnar continuing his raids and campaigns, while Lagartha managed their household and, according to some accounts, occasionally joined him in battle. But the marriage did not last. The reasons for their separation are unclear, varying between different versions of the saga. Some say Ragnar's ambitions took him away for too long, that years of absence strained their bond until it broke. Others suggest that Ragnar's eye wandered, that he became attracted to other women, and Lagartha would not tolerate such disrespect. Still others hint at conflicts over power and authority, 2 strong personalities unable to share the same space without collision. What is clear is that they parted, and while Lagartha remained a figure of power in her own right, ruling her own territory in Norway, Ragnar moved on. The separation was not hostile, according to most accounts. There was respect between them, an acknowledgement that they had been well matched, but that their paths led in different directions. Lagartha would reappear later in Ragnar's story, at a crucial moment, demonstrating that whatever had separated them, some bond remained. After Lagartha, Ragnar's attention turned to another woman, one who would become his most famous wife and the mother of his most famous sons. Her name was Aslaug, and like everything in Ragnar's life, the story of how they met blends history and legend into something that feels true even when it defies credibility. According to the saga, Aslaug was the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd, the dragon slayer, and the shield maiden Brynhild. After her parents' deaths, she was raised in secret by a poor couple who hid her noble heritage to protect her. She grew up as a peasant girl, though her intelligence and beauty suggested something more than common birth. Ragnar encountered her while his ships were beached for repairs in Norway. He sent men to a nearby farm to buy bread, and they returned speaking of an extraordinarily beautiful girl they had seen there. Ragnar was intrigued and sent for her, but rather than summoning her directly, he sent a riddle, a test of her intelligence. He commanded her to come to him, neither clothed nor naked, neither fed nor fasting, and neither alone nor in company. Aslaug solved the riddle with ease. She came to Ragnar wrapped in a fishing net, her hair loose around her, thus neither clothed nor naked. She had tasted food, but not eaten, thus neither fed nor fasting. She was accompanied by a dog, thus neither alone nor in company of humans. Ragnar was delighted by her cleverness, and immediately began courting her. Aslaug revealed her true heritage, claiming descent from heroes and possessing knowledge of ancient lore. Whether this was truth or invention is impossible to say, but Ragnar believed her, or chose to believe her, seeing in this mysterious woman a suitable match for his own ambitions. They were married, and Aslaug would bear him several sons, each of whom would become famous in their own right, each of whom would carry forward Ragnar's legacy and ambitions. The sons of Ragnar and Aslaug would become central to the Viking story, their names echoing through history. There was Ivar, called the Boneless, whose nickname may have indicated unusual flexibility or possibly some physical condition, but who would prove to be the cleverest and most ruthless of Ragnar's children. There was Bjorn, called Ironside, who would become a great warrior and explorer, leading expeditions to the Mediterranean and beyond. There was Hvitserk, whose name meant white shirt, a warrior of legendary prowess. There was Sigurd, called Snake in the Eye, because of a mark in his eye that resembled a serpent. And there was Ubbe, strong and ambitious, a leader who would help shape the future of England. These sons grew up in their father's shadow, listening to stories of his raids and conquests, training to become warriors themselves, each one determined to match or exceed Ragnar's fame. Their childhood was one of privilege and expectation, for they were sons of a king, but also one of pressure, for everyone knew that sons of famous fathers either surpassed those fathers or were crushed by the comparison. Ragnar was a present father when he could be, teaching his sons as he had been taught, passing on skills and wisdom, stories and strategies. But he was also often absent, away on his expeditions, pursuing the fame that drove him. Aslaug raised the boys, instilling in them pride in their heritage, ambition to achieve great things, and the understanding that they came from a line of heroes and were expected to continue that line. During these years, Ragnar's power and reputation continued to grow. He was no longer just a successful raider, but a king, ruling over territories in Denmark, commanding fleets of ships, gathering around him a body of warriors loyal to his leadership and attracted by his success. His hall became a place where skalds sang of ancient heroes and recent victories, where warriors gathered to drink and boast and plan new expeditions, where the business of ruling was conducted alongside the preparation for war. Yet even as Ragnar's external power grew, there were tensions within his family and his court. His older sons from his marriage to Thora, Eirik and Agnar were now grown men, warriors in their own right, and there was some friction with their younger half-brothers, Aslaug's sons. The question of succession was never far from anyone's mind, for Ragnar was aging, and whoever followed him would command enormous power and resources. The world around Ragnar was changing as well. The Viking raids that had begun as scattered attacks on isolated monasteries were becoming more organized and ambitious. Norse warriors were establishing permanent settlements in Ireland and Scotland, in the islands of the North Atlantic, even beginning to push into Francia and England. The Christian kingdoms were learning to defend themselves, building fortifications, organizing fleets to counter the Viking threat. The easy victories of earlier years were becoming harder to achieve. Ragnar understood that to maintain his reputation, to continue adding to his legend, he would need to accomplish something unprecedented, something that would set him apart from all other Viking leaders. He would need to strike at the heart of one of the great Christian kingdoms to achieve a victory so spectacular that it would ensure his name lived forever. He began planning such a raid, gathering information, studying maps and reports, preparing for the expedition that would become his most famous deed, and ultimately the beginning of his end. Ragnar's ambitions had always been vast, but by the mid-9th century they reached their apex. He began planning a raid on Paris, the capital of the Frankish kingdom, one of the wealthiest and most powerful cities in Western Europe. To attack Paris was to challenge the might of Christendom itself, to strike at the heart of a kingdom that had defeated the Vikings before. It was a bold plan, perhaps foolhardy, but that was precisely why it appealed to Ragnar. Glory required risk. Fame demanded deeds that others thought impossible. The Francia of this period was in turmoil. The Carolingian Empire, built by Charlemagne, was fragmenting among his squabbling grandsons. Charles the Bald ruled the western portion, which included Paris, but his authority was contested and his resources stretched thin. The kingdom was vulnerable, distracted by internal conflicts, unable to muster its full strength against external threats. Ragnar understood this. He had spies and traders who brought him information, who told him about the political situation, about the defenses of Paris, about the best time to strike. In the spring of 845, Ragnar assembled a fleet. The exact number of ships varies depending on the source, some saying 120 vessels, each carrying perhaps 30 to 40 warriors, giving Ragnar an army of several thousand men. It was an enormous force, the largest Viking expedition assembled up to that time, a demonstration of Ragnar's power and the loyalty he commanded. The fleet sailed up the Seine River, that wide waterway that flows through the heart of Francia to the sea. They moved slowly, deliberately, allowing news of their approach to spread before them. Ragnar wanted the Franks to know he was coming, wanted them to feel fear, wanted the psychological advantage that came from being perceived as an unstoppable force. Along the way, his warriors raided settlements, burned villages, took plunder and captives, leaving a trail of destruction that announced their presence. Charles the Bald attempted to organize a defense. He gathered an army and positioned it on both banks of the Seine, intending to prevent the Vikings from reaching Paris. But when the two forces met, the Frankish defense crumbled. The Vikings fought with the ferocity for which they were famous, and the Frankish levies, farmers and townsmen pressed into military service could not stand against such seasoned warriors. Ragnar employed a tactic that demonstrated both his ruthlessness and his understanding of psychological warfare. He took prisoners from the defeated Frankish force and hanged 110 of them in view of the remaining defenders on the opposite bank. It was a message, brutal and clear. Resist, and this would be your fate. The Frankish soldiers on the far bank saw their comrades hanging and lost their will to fight. They fled, and the path to Paris lay open. On March 28, 845, Ragnar's fleet reached Paris. The city was defended by walls and towers, by the island citadel in the center of the Seine, but it was not prepared for an assault of this magnitude. The Vikings surrounded the city, their ships filling the river, their warriors spreading along both banks. Ragnar established a siege, though he did not immediately attack. He waited, allowing the people of Paris to contemplate their situation, to understand that help was not coming, that they stood alone against this northern tide. Inside the city, panic spread. Paris had not faced a Viking raid on this scale before. The people could see the dragon-prowed ships on the river, could see the smoke from burning settlements upstream, could hear the sounds of the Viking camp at night, the singing and shouting of warriors who knew they held all the advantages. Charles the Bald was elsewhere, unable to bring an army to relieve the city, unable to do anything but watch as his capital stood under threat. Ragnar could have stormed Paris. His warriors were eager for plunder, ready to scale the walls and take the city by force. But Ragnar had learned that there were different kinds of victory. A sacked city would yield immediate wealth, but would also cost lives, would leave Paris destroyed and unable to pay future tributes. A clever leader took the long view, understanding that a wealthy city left standing could be raided again. That fear could be more profitable than destruction. He sent envoys to Charles the Bald with a proposal. In exchange for an enormous payment of silver, 7,000 pounds of it, Ragnar would leave Paris untouched and withdraw his forces. It was extortion on a massive scale, demanding wealth that would strain the Frankish treasury. But Charles understood that he had no choice. He could not defeat Ragnar's army in battle. He had already tried and failed. He could not defend Paris against a determined assault. The only option was to pay. The payment became known as Dungeld, the first of many such payments that Viking leaders would extract from European kingdoms over the coming decades. Charles gathered the silver from churches and monasteries, from the royal treasury, from wealthy nobles, assembling the enormous sum that Ragnar demanded. On Easter Sunday, the silver was delivered to Ragnar's camp, loaded onto his ships, while the people of Paris watched from their walls, humiliated but alive. Ragnar kept his word. He withdrew his fleet, sailing back down the Seine with ships laden with silver, leaving Paris intact but terrified. The raid was a spectacular success, the greatest Viking achievement up to that time, and Ragnar's name spread across Europe. He had accomplished what no other Viking leader had managed. He had held the capital of a great Christian kingdom to ransom and emerged victorious without even having to fight for it. But the victory came with a cost that Ragnar could not have foreseen. According to Frankish chronicles, many of the Vikings who participated in the raid fell ill shortly after, struck by disease, possibly dysentery or plague. Hundreds died, and the survivors interpreted this as divine punishment, as God's wrath for their attack on a Christian city on Easter. Whether Ragnar himself believed this is unclear, but the losses must have tempered his triumph, must have reminded him that even the greatest victories could carry hidden dangers. Ragnar returned to Denmark laden with silver and glory. His reputation now extended far beyond Scandinavia. In England and Francia, in Ireland and Scotland, people spoke his name with fear and respect. He had proven that even the mightiest Christian kingdoms could be brought low, that the Vikings were not mere raiders, but a force that could challenge the established powers of Europe. He had set a precedent, shown other Viking leaders what was possible, opened the door to an era of escalating raids and conquests. His sons looked at their father with new admiration, and perhaps a degree of envy. Ragnar had accomplished something legendary, something that would be spoken of for generations. They too wanted such fame, such glory, such achievements to call their own. The seeds were planted for their own future expeditions, their own attempts to match or exceed what their father had done. But Ragnar himself may have felt differently about his accomplishment than others assumed. He had achieved his goal, won his fame, taken his silver. Yet fame was like hunger, never truly satisfied, always demanding more. A great deed became yesterday's news, and to maintain a reputation, a man needed to keep accomplishing new feats, keep pushing forward, keep taking risks. Ragnar had set for himself a standard that would be difficult to maintain, and he was no longer young. The question of what came next, what could possibly compare to Paris, must have weighed on him during the voyage home. The years following the Paris raid were prosperous for Ragnar, yet they were also marked by a subtle restlessness, a sense that he had reached a peak and now faced the inevitability of decline. He was a king now, firmly established, no longer needing to prove himself through constant warfare. He had wealth, power, sons who would carry on his line, and a reputation that stretched across the known world. By all measures, he had achieved everything a Viking could hope to achieve. Yet kingship brought its own burdens, different from, but no less heavy than the challenges of his earlier life. A king could not simply lead raids whenever the mood struck him. He had territories to govern, disputes to settle, alliances to maintain, enemies to watch. The freedom of his younger years, when he could take ship and sail wherever adventure called, was constrained by the responsibilities of rule. Ragnar spent more time in his hall during these years, holding court, listening to petitions, making judgments, managing the complex web of relationships that held his kingdom together. It was necessary work, important work, but it lacked the immediacy and excitement of his earlier life. He was becoming an administrator, a politician, when his heart still longed for the simplicity of a ship's deck and the horizon beyond. His sons were growing into warriors, each developing his own character and ambitions. Ivar, despite whatever physical challenges his nickname might suggest, showed a brilliant strategic mind and a ruthless willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. Bjorn displayed the physical prowess and courage that made him a natural leader of men. Hvitserk, Sigurd, and Ubba each showed promise in different ways, and Ragnar watched them with pride and perhaps some concern, knowing that such ambitious sons could become rivals to each other, and even to him. Ragnar's older sons, Eirik and Agnar, from his marriage to Thora, felt increasingly marginalized as Aslaug's sons grew in prominence. They sought to prove themselves worthy of their father's name, to demonstrate that they were not lesser simply because their mother had died young. The saga tells of an expedition they undertook to Sweden, attempting to win glory and territory, driven partly by ambition and partly by the need to establish themselves independently of their more famous half-brothers. The expedition went badly. Eirik and Agnar were captured by the Swedish king, who knew exactly who they were and saw an opportunity to strike at Ragnar indirectly. Rather than ransoming them or holding them as hostages, the Swedish king executed them both, throwing their bodies into a snake pit, a death calculated to insult and enrage their father. The news reached Ragnar like a physical blow. Another loss, another reminder that even kings could not protect everyone they loved. Aslaug, when she heard how Ragnar's older sons had died, felt a complex mixture of emotions. She had never been hostile to them, but neither had she promoted their interests over those of her own children. Now they were gone, and her sons were Ragnar's only male heirs, a fact that could not have escaped her notice or theirs. The path to inheriting Ragnar's power and reputation was clearer now, though it had been cleared by tragedy. Ragnar's grief over the deaths of Eirik and Agnar was profound but private. He did not display it openly, for Norse culture valued stoic endurance of loss, but those close to him could see it in his silences, in the way he stared into the fire during feasts, in the increased edge to his temper. He had outlived 2 of his sons, a reversal of the natural order, and it weighed on him in ways that battles and raids never had. During this period, there were other expeditions, other raids, but none as spectacular as Paris. Ragnar sent out fleets under his command or under the command of his sons and trusted lieutenants. They raided along the coasts of England and Francia, in Ireland and the Baltic. These expeditions brought wealth and maintained Ragnar's reputation, but they were routine by now, expected, no longer surprising. The world had adjusted to the Viking threat, built defenses, learned to anticipate raids. The easy victories of earlier years were increasingly rare. Ragnar himself participated in fewer and fewer raids as he aged. There came a point where he had to acknowledge that his body no longer responded as it once had, that the wounds accumulated over a lifetime of fighting were taking their toll. He was not yet an old man by any measure, probably only in his 50s, but for a Viking warrior, that was approaching the end of active service. Younger men were faster, stronger, more eager. Ragnar's role was shifting from warrior to war leader, from participant to planner, from the man who stormed beaches to the man who decided which beaches to storm. This transition was difficult for him. His entire identity was bound up in being a warrior, in personal courage and physical prowess. To step back from the front lines felt like a kind of death, an admission that his best years were behind him. He became restless, irritable, prone to long silences or sudden bursts of activity that seemed calculated to prove he was still capable, still vital, still the man he had always been. Aslaug watched her husband struggle with concern. She understood that Ragnar was a man who defined himself by his deeds, who needed challenges to feel alive. Without those challenges, he was like a ship without wind, capable of movement, but going nowhere, drifting. She tried to counsel him, to suggest that there were other forms of greatness, that ruling wisely and raising strong sons were achievements equal to any raid. But Ragnar heard only the implication that his fighting days were over, and he resisted that conclusion with all his considerable will. The court around Ragnar during these years was a complex place, filled with ambitious men and women, all maneuvering for advantage. There were jarls who owed Ragnar loyalty, but who were always calculating whether that loyalty was still in their best interest. There were foreign visitors, traders, and spies bringing news from across the Viking world and beyond. There were skalds composing poems about Ragnar's deeds, ensuring his fame would outlast his life, but also sometimes hinting that his greatest achievements were in the past, an implication that stung. Ragnar's relationship with Aslaug during these years was stable, but not without tension. They had been married for decades, and the passion of their early years had settled into something more comfortable, but also more complicated. Aslaug was a strong personality, intelligent and politically astute, and she had her own ideas about how the kingdom should be run and how their sons should be prepared for leadership. Sometimes those ideas clashed with Ragnar's, and neither was inclined to yield easily. There were rumors, never confirmed but persistent, that Ragnar's eye had wandered to other women, that he kept concubines or entertained lovers when he travelled. Whether these rumors had any truth is impossible to say, but Aslaug heard them, and they must have caused pain, or at least annoyance. She was not a woman to suffer disrespect quietly, but neither could she afford to create a public rift with her husband while her sons were still establishing themselves. The sons themselves were becoming forces to be reckoned with. Bjorn was leading his own expeditions, building his own reputation separate from his father's. Ivar was involving himself in the politics of the kingdom, demonstrating a talent for manipulation and strategy that sometimes unsettled even Ragnar. Hvitserk, Sigurd, and Ubbe were all proven warriors now, each commanding respect and gathering their own followers. The hall that had once centered entirely on Ragnar was becoming a place where multiple centers of power coexisted, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes uneasily. Ragnar must have felt time pressing on him, must have sensed that his era was ending and his son's era beginning. This was natural, the way of all things. But that knowledge did not make it easier to bear. He had spent his entire life building his reputation, and now he could feel it being eclipsed, not by enemies or rivals, but by his own children, which should have been a source of pride, but felt also like a kind of diminishment. It was during this period of restlessness and transition that Ragnar began to think about England. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms across the North Sea represented an opportunity and a challenge. They were wealthy and relatively vulnerable, divided among themselves, offering rich plunder and the possibility of conquest and settlement. Danish and Norwegian Vikings had been raiding England for decades, but there had been no large-scale conquest, no attempt to take and hold territory on the scale that Ragnar was beginning to imagine. Reports reached him from England of political instability, of kings rising and falling, of kingdoms weakened by internal conflict. Northumbria in particular seemed vulnerable, ruled by a king named Aela, who was said to be competent, but whose kingdom lacked the strength to resist a serious Viking assault. Ragnar listened to these reports with growing interest, his mind turning over possibilities, strategies, potential campaigns. His sons listened too, and they saw their father's renewed energy, his return to the planning and preparation that had always preceded his greatest ventures. They understood that Ragnar was contemplating one more major expedition, one final attempt to add to his legend, to prove that he was not yet finished, that he could still accomplish deeds worthy of song. They wanted to support him, to participate in what might be his last great adventure, but they also had concerns about the risks involved. Aslaug was more direct in her opposition. She counseled Ragnar to stay home, to be content with what he had achieved, to enjoy his remaining years rather than risking them in pursuit of more glory. She reminded him that he had sons who could lead raids, that he did not need to personally command every expedition, that wisdom sometimes meant knowing when to step back. But Ragnar heard only doubt in her words, a suggestion that he was too old, too past his prime, no longer capable of what he had once accomplished. The exact motivations for what Ragnar decided to do next are unclear in the sources. Some suggest it was pure ambition, a final grasp for glory. Others hint at a death wish, a sense that Ragnar preferred to die in battle, achieving fame, rather than fade away in his hall. Still others propose that there was a prophetic element, that Ragnar had consulted seers who told him his fate was woven, that he would die in England, but that his death would ultimately lead to great victories for his sons. Whatever his reasons, Ragnar made his decision. He would lead an expedition to England, specifically to Northumbria, and he would do so with a relatively small force. This last detail troubled many of his advisers and his sons. The days of taking 100 ships were behind him, but to go to England with only a few ships seemed not bold, but reckless. Ragnar insisted that a smaller force would be sufficient, that surprise and cunning would matter more than numbers. But many suspected he was seeking not just victory, but an honorable death, a warrior's end that would cement his legend. His sons were divided on whether to accompany him. Ivar strongly opposed the expedition, arguing that it was poorly planned, and that if Ragnar was determined to go, he should at least take a larger force. The others wavered, torn between loyalty to their father and their own judgment that the expedition was unwise. In the end, Ragnar decided to go without them, to make this venture his own, perhaps proving to himself and everyone else that he did not need his son's strength, that he was still capable of accomplishing great deeds on his own. Aslaug made one final attempt to dissuade him. According to the Saga, she offered to weave him a magical shirt that would protect him from harm, a garment that would turn aside blades and arrows, keep him safe from injury. Whether she actually believed in the magic, or whether this was simply a mother's desperate attempt to protect her husband, is unclear. Ragnar refused the shirt, or perhaps he took it, but chose not to wear it, or perhaps he wore it, but it failed. The details vary, but the implication is clear. Ragnar was determined to face his fate without supernatural protection, to meet whatever came as a warrior should, with only his own courage and skill. In the spring, probably around 865, though dates are uncertain, Ragnar assembled a small fleet and set sail for England. Those who watched him depart must have felt a sense of foreboding, must have wondered if they were seeing him for the last time. Ragnar himself gave no sign of doubt or fear. He stood on the deck of his ship as the coast of Denmark faded behind him, facing forward toward England and whatever destiny waited for him there. The journey across the North Sea was routine, the kind of crossing Ragnar had made dozens of times before. The ships sailed with the wind and current, moving steadily westward until the coast of Northumbria came into view. Ragnar's plan was to land, establish a base, and begin raiding, testing Northumbria's defences, probing for weakness. But fate, or poor planning, or simple bad luck intervened. A storm rose as the fleet approached the coast, a sudden squall that caught them exposed and unprepared. The ships were driven toward the shore with too much speed, unable to maneuver properly, and they wrecked on the rocky coast of Northumbria. Men drowned in the surf, ships broke apart on the rocks. Those who made it to shore found themselves scattered, disorganized, far from any friendly territory in the heart of enemy lands. Ragnar survived the shipwreck, but his force was decimated. Instead of a planned raid with adequate numbers, he now commanded a desperate, exhausted band of survivors. They were surrounded by hostile territory, with no ships to retreat to, no reinforcements to call upon, no options except to fight or surrender. It was the worst possible beginning to a campaign, and for a lesser leader, it might have ended in immediate disaster. But Ragnar was not a lesser leader. Even in this desperate situation, he rallied his men and attempted to accomplish something. They fought several skirmishes with local forces, trying to establish a defensible position, trying to live off the land, trying to survive long enough for rescue or reinforcement. For a time, they succeeded, their skill and desperation allowing them to hold out against growing numbers of Northumbrian soldiers. But King Aela of Northumbria was gathering a proper army, and when he finally brought his full force against Ragnar's diminished band, the outcome was inevitable. Ragnar's men fought bravely, selling their lives as dearly as they could, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Ragnar himself was captured alive, taken prisoner by Aela's soldiers, bound and brought before the Northumbrian king. Aela knew exactly who his prisoner was. Ragnar Lothbrok was the most famous Viking leader of his generation, the man who had raided Paris, who had terrorized Christian Europe for decades, whose name was synonymous with Viking power and audacity. To have captured such a man was itself a victory, a prize beyond measure. But Aela also understood that holding Ragnar prisoner was dangerous, that Viking forces might come seeking his release, that as long as Ragnar lived, he represented a threat. The king decided that Ragnar must die, but not by a simple execution. The death needed to be public, dramatic, a demonstration of Christian power over the pagan raiders, a warning to other Vikings about what awaited those who attacked Northumbria. Aela ordered a snake pit prepared, a deep hole filled with venomous serpents, and he had Ragnar thrown into it. The account of Ragnar's death in the snake pit is one of the most famous episodes in the sagas, though whether it happened exactly as described is impossible to verify. According to the story, Ragnar stood in the pit as the snakes bit him, their venom coursing through his body, bringing agonizing death. But he did not scream or beg for mercy. Instead, he recited a poem, a death song, speaking of his life and his deeds, proclaiming that the piglets would grunt when they heard of the old boar's death, a reference to his sons and a prophecy of the vengeance they would take. The poem attributed to Ragnar in his final moments is called the Krakumal, or the Song of the Crow. It speaks of battles fought and victories won, of a life lived fully and without regret, of the certainty that he would soon feast in Valhalla with the gods and heroes. It ends with the famous lines expressing his joy at dying. his laughter in the face of death, his certainty that his sons would avenge him, and that his name would live forever. Whether Ragnar actually composed such a poem while dying in a snake pit is doubtful. The poem, as we have it, was written down centuries later and shows the sophistication of a trained skald, not the spontaneous composition of a dying man. But the fact that later generations believed Ragnar capable of such a death, that they wanted to remember him this way, says something important about how he was perceived, about the kind of man he represented in the Norse imagination. Ragnar Lothbrok died far from home, in an enemy land, defeated and alone, a death that by all measures should have been an ignominious end to a great life. Yet the manner of his dying, his courage in the face of death, his final defiant words, transformed what could have been a tragedy into something closer to triumph. He had lived as he wanted to live, had died a warrior's death, and had left behind sons who would carry on his work and his name. In the Norse understanding of fate and fame, he had accomplished everything a man could hope to accomplish. News of Ragnar's death travelled slowly across the cold waters between England and Scandinavia, carried by survivors of the expedition who had managed to escape, or by traders who heard the story from English sources. When word finally reached Denmark, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Ragnar's sons gathered to hear the full account of their father's fate, and what they felt in that moment was captured in the sagas with dramatic precision. Ivar, the clever one, was playing chess when the news arrived. He gripped the piece he was holding so tightly that blood ran from beneath his fingernails, but his face remained composed, betraying nothing of the storm inside. Bjorn was gripping a spear shaft, and at the news he squeezed so hard that the wood left an imprint in his palm. Hvitserk was playing a game involving a sharp blade, and he gripped it so tightly that he cut himself to the bone. Sigurd was trimming his nails with a knife, and at the news he cut himself so deeply that the knife scraped bone. Ubi's face changed colour, going red, then white, then red again, like blood flowing and draining away. These physical reactions, whether literal truth or symbolic representation, conveyed the intensity of emotion the brothers felt. Grief, certainly, but also rage and a burning need for vengeance. Their father, the greatest Viking leader of his generation, had been killed by a Christian king in a manner calculated to insult and dishonor. This could not stand. To leave such a death unavenged would bring shame on all of them, would suggest that Ragnar's sons were weak, that the name Lothbrok no longer commanded respect. The brothers began planning their response immediately. This would not be a simple raid or a minor expedition. This would be an invasion, a full-scale military campaign designed to conquer Northumbria, to capture King Aella, and to exact a revenge so thorough and terrible that it would be remembered for generations. They would assemble the largest Viking army ever seen, drawing warriors from across Scandinavia and beyond, uniting different factions and leaders under a common purpose. The army they assembled became known to the Anglo-Saxons as the Great Heathen Army, a name that conveyed both the size of the force and the fear it inspired. Estimates of its size vary wildly from a few thousand to tens of thousands, but what is clear is that it represented a qualitative shift in Viking activity in England. Previous raids had been conducted by hundreds of warriors at most. This was an army capable of conquering kingdoms, of taking and holding territory, of fundamentally changing the political landscape of England. The brothers divided responsibilities among themselves according to their strengths. Ivar, despite his physical limitations, was acknowledged as the strategic leader, the one who would plan campaigns and negotiate with enemies. Bjorn and the others would lead forces in the field, commanding warriors in battle, implementing Ivar's strategies. Together, they formed a formidable leadership team, each brother complementing the other's weaknesses, united by blood and common purpose. In 865, the great heathen army landed in East Anglia. They came not in the raiding season of summer, but in autumn, indicating that this was not a raid, but a permanent military presence. They seized horses from the East Anglians, transforming themselves into a mobile force that could strike anywhere quickly. They established a fortified camp and began extracting supplies and tribute from the surrounding territory, making it clear that they intended to stay. The East Anglian king, Edmund, initially tried to buy them off, providing food and horses in exchange for a promise that they would not attack his kingdom. The Vikings accepted the supplies, but made no firm promises about the future. They were using East Anglia as a base from which to launch their real objective, the conquest of Northumbria and the capture of King Aella. In 866, the great heathen army marched north into Northumbria. They moved with discipline and purpose, not scattered raid-in bands, but a coordinated military force. The timing was perfect, for Northumbria was in the midst of a civil war. Aella was fighting a rival claimant to the throne, and the kingdom was divided against itself, unable to present a united front against the Viking invasion. The Vikings seized York, the capital of Northumbria, with little resistance. The city's defences were not prepared for an assault of this magnitude, and many of the Northumbrian soldiers who might have defended it were scattered across the kingdom, fighting each other rather than the invaders. The fall of York was a catastrophic blow to Northumbria, both strategically and psychologically. The Vikings now controlled the most important city in the north of England. Aella and his rival were forced to put aside their conflict and unite against the common threat. They assembled an army and attempted to retake York in 867. The battle was fierce, fought in the streets of the city and around its walls, but the Vikings were better prepared and better led. The Northumbrian army was defeated, and both Aella and his rival were killed or captured in the fighting. What happened to Aella after his capture became one of the most famous and gruesome episodes in Viking history. According to the sagas, Ivar had him executed using a method called the blood eagle, a ritual killing that involved cutting the ribs from the spine and pulling out the lungs to create a wing-like appearance. Whether this actually happened is hotly debated by historians. The blood eagle appears in several sagas, but might be a later invention or a misunderstanding of poetic language. What is clear is that Aella died at the hands of Ragnar's sons, and that his death was meant to be both vengeance and a warning. With Aella dead and Northumbria conquered, Ragnar's sons had accomplished their primary objective. They had avenged their father in spectacular fashion, destroying an entire kingdom in the process. But they did not simply declare victory and return home. They had assembled a massive army and that army needed to be fed and paid. Moreover, the brothers had discovered that conquering Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was easier than they had anticipated, and the rewards were substantial. Why stop at Northumbria when all of England lay open before them? Over the following years, the great heathen army ranged across England, conquering kingdom after kingdom. Mercia fell under their control, its king fleeing into exile. East Anglia was conquered, and King Edmund, who had initially tried to appease the Vikings, was killed. According to legend, Edmund was martyred for refusing to renounce his Christian faith, shot full of arrows, and then beheaded. He would later be canonized as St. Edmund, becoming one of England's most important martyrs. Only Wessex, the kingdom in the south, managed to resist the Viking conquest. Under King Ethelred and his brother Alfred, who would later be known as Alfred the Great, Wessex fought a series of battles against the Vikings, sometimes winning, often losing, but never surrendering entirely. The conflict between Wessex and the great heathen army would continue for years, shaping the future of England. But the unity of Ragnar's sons didn't last as long as their military success. As the years passed and kingdoms fell, differences emerged among the brothers. Some, like Ivar, seemed content to rule the territories they had conquered, to establish permanent Viking kingdoms in England. Others, like Bjorn, grew restless and wanted new challenges, new territories to explore and conquer. The bonds of brotherhood that had united them in vengeance began to fray as their individual ambitions pulled them in different directions. Ivar took control of the Viking kingdom based in York, ruling over Northumbria and parts of Mercia. He showed talent for governance as well as warfare, establishing systems of administration, minting coins, managing the complex relationships between the Viking settlers and the native Anglo-Saxon population. He was transforming himself from a raider into a king, building something that might last beyond his own lifetime. Bjorn, by contrast, felt confined by England. He had avenged his father, had won great victories, but he wanted something more, something that would establish his own reputation independent of his father's shadow and his brother's achievements. He began planning an expedition that would take him far beyond England, to lands most Vikings had never seen, to the very edge of the known world. The saga tells that Bjorn eventually led an expedition to the Mediterranean, sailing through the Straits of Gibraltar and raiding along the coasts of Spain, North Africa, and Italy. Whether this was literally true or a conflation of multiple expeditions is unclear, but it represents Bjorn's desire to carve out his own legend, to accomplish deeds that would be remembered not as extensions of his father's fame, but as achievements in their own right. The other brothers followed their own paths. Witzurk remained a warrior, fighting in various campaigns across England and Scandinavia. Sigurd carved out his own territory in England. Ubam eventually led a portion of the army to settle in East Anglia, transitioning from raider to settler, from conqueror to ruler. Each brother took from their father's legacy what suited them, interpreted it through their own ambitions and personalities, and built their own versions of success. The great heathen army itself eventually fragmented, as armies do when the purpose that united them is fulfilled. The Vikings who had come for vengeance and conquest now had to decide what to do with their victories, Some returned to Scandinavia with their plunder, wealthy enough to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Others stayed in England, taking land, marrying local women, establishing farms and settlements. They were becoming something new. Not quite Viking and not quite English, the ancestors of the people who would come to be called the Danelaw Norse. Ragnar had been dead for less than a decade, but already his sons had transformed his legacy. They had taken his death and turned it into the catalyst for the Viking conquest of England. They had accomplished more than he ever had, conquered more territory, commanded larger armies, changed the political map of an entire country. Yet everything they did was done in his shadow, was justified and explained by reference to him. Ragnar in death had become even more powerful than Ragnar in life, transformed from a man into a symbol, a rallying point, a reason to fight and conquer. As the years passed and the initial fury of vengeance cooled, the differences between Ragnar's sons became more pronounced. They had been united by a common purpose, but with that purpose achieved, they discovered that they were 5 very different men with very different visions of what they wanted to accomplish. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok was becoming the sagas of his sons, plural, each one branching off into its own story, its own legend. Ivar remained in England, consolidating his power in the territories the great heathen army had conquered. He showed a talent for political maneuvering that suggested he had inherited more from his mother Aslaug than just her intelligence. He played Anglo-Saxon factions against each other, made alliances when convenient and broke them when necessary, and slowly built a kingdom that was neither purely Viking nor purely Anglo-Saxon, but something new, a hybrid culture that would eventually become the Danelaw. The nickname Boneless that had defined Ivar since childhood remains one of history's mysteries. Some modern scholars have suggested it might have referred to flexibility, either physical or political, his ability to bend without breaking. Others have proposed various medical conditions that might have affected his bones or mobility. Still others think it might have been a mistranslation or a poetic metaphor that was later taken literally. What is clear is that whatever physical limitations he might have had did not prevent him from becoming the most successful of Ragnar's sons in terms of lasting political power. Ivar's rule in York was marked by pragmatism rather than idealism. He understood that a Viking minority could not hold down an Anglo-Saxon majority through force alone. He needed to win cooperation, or at least acquiescence, from the native population. He allowed Anglo-Saxon nobles who submitted to keep their lands and positions. He respected local customs and laws where they did not conflict with his interests. He even showed a degree of tolerance toward Christianity, understanding that most of his subjects were Christian, and that forcing conversion to the Norse gods would only create resistance. This pragmatic approach brought Ivar into conflict with more traditional Vikings who wanted to maintain pure Norse culture, who saw any accommodation with the Anglo-Saxons as weakness or betrayal. But Ivar was building something that could last, not just raiding for immediate plunder, but establishing a dynasty. He married, possibly to an Irish princess, and fathered children who would continue his line. He was transforming from warrior to statesman, from conqueror to administrator. Meanwhile, Bjorn Ironside pursued a very different path. He had participated in the Conquest of England, had played his role in avenging Ragnar, but his heart was not in governance or settlement. He was his father's son in the most fundamental way, driven by the need for glory, for adventure, for deeds that would be sung about in halls and remembered for generations. England was conquered, but the world was large, and Bjorn wanted to see how much of it he could claim for himself. According to the sagas, Bjorn led an expedition south and west, sailing through waters no Viking fleet had navigated before. He passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, that narrow passage the ancients had called the Pillars of Hercules, marking the edge of the known world. Beyond lay the Mediterranean, that vast inland sea where civilizations had risen and fallen for thousands of years, where Rome had once ruled supreme, where countless wealthy cities offered tempting targets for a bold raider. Bjorn's Mediterranean expedition, if it happened as described, would have been one of the great Viking voyages, comparable to the later discovery of Iceland and Greenland, to the eventual reaching of North America. His fleet raided along the coasts of Spain and North Africa, attacked settlements in southern France, possibly even reaching Italy. The stories tell of attacks on cities and monasteries, of battles with Arab pirates and Byzantine fleets, of Bjorn navigating not just waters, but cultures entirely different from anything he had known in the north. One story from this expedition has become particularly famous, though its truth is questionable. Bjorn supposedly attempted to raid Rome itself, or what he thought was Rome, which turned out to be a different Italian city. Finding the city too well defended to storm, he devised a trick. He sent messengers claiming that the Viking leader had died and requesting permission to bury him in the city's church, as he had converted to Christianity before his death. The sympathetic citizens allowed the funeral procession to enter. Once inside, Bjorn leapt from his coffin. His warriors drew their hidden weapons, and they took the city from within. Whether this story is true or borrowed from earlier legends hardly matters. It represents how people wanted to remember Bjorn, as clever and bold, willing to use any tactic to achieve victory, respecting no boundaries or conventions. He was the adventurer, the explorer, the one who always pushed further, who never settled, who embodied the restless Viking spirit in its purest form. The other brothers each found their own ways forward. Hvitserk remained a warrior, but his story in the sagas becomes confused with other figures, suggesting that he may not have achieved the same level of individual fame as Ivar or Bjorn. He fought in various campaigns, served different leaders, and eventually, according to some accounts, made his way to Rus, the Viking settlements in what is now Russia and Ukraine, where he continued his career as a warrior in a very different context. Sigurd Snake in the Eye established himself in Zealand and parts of Denmark, inheriting what remained of Ragnar's original kingdom. He was neither as politically brilliant as Ivar nor as adventurous as Bjorn, but he was competent and steady, the kind of leader who could maintain what had been built rather than expanding or transforming it. His descendants would continue to rule in Denmark for generations, carrying forward the bloodline even as the individual stories became less dramatic. Ubbi took perhaps the most practical path of all. He led a portion of the great heathen army to settle in East Anglia, accepting land in exchange for peace with the Kingdom of Wessex. He and his followers became farmers and landowners, maintaining their Viking identity, but also integrating into English life. It was Ubbe and men like him who would create the Danelaw, that region of England where Danish law and customs prevailed, where Norse and Anglo-Saxon cultures blended into something unique. The relationship between the brothers during these years was complex. They were not enemies exactly, but neither were they the united force they had been during the invasion of England. Distance separated them, both physical and emotional. Years would pass without them seeing each other. They had their own territories to manage, their own families to raise, their own ambitions to pursue. The bonds of brotherhood remained, but they were stretched thin, maintained more through memory and occasional cooperation than through constant contact. Back in Scandinavia, Aslaug watched her sons' diverging paths with feelings that must have been complicated. She had raised them to be ambitious, to seek glory, to honor their father's memory. They had done all of that, and more. But they were also scattered across the known world, pursuing their own goals, no longer the boys who had sat in her hall, listening to stories of their father's deeds. She had wanted them to be great, and they had become great. But greatness came at the cost of family cohesion, of simple domestic happiness. Aslaug's own end, as recorded in the sagas, was tragic. According to one version, she was killed by Lagartha, Ragnar's first wife, who had maintained her own power in Norway and who saw an opportunity to strike at her former rival. Whether this actually happened is questionable, for the saga's chronology is unclear, and Lagartha might have died long before Aslaug. But the story represents the idea that the conflicts and complications of Ragnar's life continued long after his death, that the choices he made and the women he loved were still playing out their consequences decades later. The generation of Ragnar Lothbrok was passing. The man himself was long dead, transformed into legend. Aslaug was gone, whether killed by Lagartha or simply by time and age. The sons were aging too, no longer the young warriors who had invaded England, but middle-aged men with their own children, their own concerns, their own places in history. The Viking Age was continuing, but it was changing, becoming less about dramatic raids and more about settlement and integration, less about individual heroes and more about political consolidation. Yet Ragnar's name remained powerful, perhaps more powerful than when he had lived. His sons invoked him constantly, using his reputation to justify their actions, to rally warriors, to establish their own legitimacy. Stories about him spread and grew, accumulating embellishments and mythological elements, until it became difficult to separate the historical Ragnar from the legendary Ragnar. He was becoming less a person who had lived, and more an idea, a symbol of Viking power and ambition, a name that carried weight across the northern world. The later years of Ragnar's sons were marked by the same violence and ambition that had defined their father's life, but also by a growing sense that the world was changing around them, that the age of easy Viking victories was ending. The kingdoms of Europe were learning to defend themselves, building fortifications, organizing fleets, adapting to the Viking threat. What had been possible for Ragnar's generation was becoming harder for their children's generation. Ivar ruled in York until his death, the date of which is uncertain, but probably around 873. The sources say little about his final years, suggesting that they were spent in the work of governing rather than in dramatic raids or battles. He died, some sources say, of a sudden illness, though others hint at violence. His death was not the warrior's end in battle that Viking culture idolized, but it came after he had accomplished what he set out to do. He had avenged his father, conquered a kingdom, and established a legacy that would continue through his children. What is perhaps most interesting about Ivar is how his story was remembered. Despite whatever physical limitations his nickname might suggest, despite dying a straw death rather than falling in battle, he was honored and remembered as one of the greatest Viking leaders. His intelligence and strategic ability were valued as much as any warrior's prowess. In a culture that celebrated warriors above all, Ivar demonstrated that there were multiple paths to greatness, multiple ways to leave one's mark on history. Bjorn Ironside returned eventually from his Mediterranean adventures, laden with plunder and stories that seemed almost too fantastic to believe. He settled in Sweden, ruling over Uppsala and establishing a line that would produce future Swedish kings. He had accomplished what he set out to do, had adventures that rivaled or exceeded his father's, had established his own legend independent of Ragnar's shadow. He died sometime in the late 9th century, and according to legend, was buried in a massive mound that still stands today, a monument to his fame. The story of Bjorn's death, like so much of his life, exists in the space between history and legend. One account says he was killed in battle, achieving the death every Viking wanted. Another says he died in his bed, of age or illness, but that his body was so large and his reputation so fearsome that even in death he was treated with extraordinary respect. His burial mound supposedly contained massive amounts of treasure, though no one dared to rob it for fear of Bjorn's ghost. Ubbe lived out his years in East Anglia, dying peacefully as a landowner and farmer, his raiding days long behind him. His story is less dramatic than those of his brothers, but in many ways more important, for he represents the transition from Viking raiders to Danish settlers, from temporary invasions to permanent colonization. The Dane law that he helped establish would shape English culture for centuries, contributing words to the English language, legal concepts to English law, and genes to the English population. Hvitserk's fate is unclear, with different sources giving different accounts. Some say he burned himself to death on a funeral pyre, choosing his own end in a dramatic gesture. Others say he died in battle in the lands of the Rus. Still others suggest he converted to Christianity and ended his days as a monk, seeking peace and redemption after a lifetime of violence. The confusion about Hvitserk's end suggests that he may have been less famous than his brothers, his individual story less important to saga writers than the collective story of Ragnar's sons. Sigurd Snake in the Eye ruled in Denmark until his death, passing his kingdom to his sons, continuing the dynasty. His story is the least developed in the sagas, perhaps because he stayed in familiar territory, governing inherited lands rather than conquering new ones. He was successful, but not spectacular, important, but not legendary, the kind of leader who maintains stability rather than seeking glory. As Ragnar's sons died, one by one, over the course of decades, their own children were growing up, creating another generation that would carry forward the family name and reputation. Some of these grandchildren would become significant figures in their own right. Ragnar's grandson, also named Ragnar, would rule in Ireland. Another grandson would become a king in Norway. The bloodline spread and multiplied, branching into multiple royal houses across Scandinavia and the Viking colonies. But with each passing generation, the connection to the original Ragnar became more attenuated. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren knew him only through stories, through the tales told by their parents and grandparents, through the poems of skalds. He was not a real person to them, but an ancestor, almost mythological, a name invoked for legitimacy and inspiration rather than a man whose actual personality and choices were remembered. The Viking Age itself was changing. The era of large-scale raids was giving way to more organized warfare and political maneuvering. The Vikings were no longer outsiders attacking Christian Europe, but participants in European politics, rulers of kingdoms, converts to Christianity in many cases, integrated into the very societies they had once terrorized. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, driven by the simple reality that a raiding economy could not sustain itself indefinitely. That settlement and trade were more profitable in the long run than piracy and warfare. By the end of the 9th century, just decades after Ragnar's death, the world he had known was already disappearing. The easy targets were gone, defended or destroyed. The political landscape had shifted, with stronger kingdoms and better defenses. The Vikings who had been raiders were becoming landowners, merchants, even kings. The culture was adapting, incorporating Christian elements, developing new forms of social organization, transforming from a purely martial culture into something more complex. Ragnar Lothbrok had lived at the perfect moment, the heat of the Viking Age, when the raiders from the north were at their most powerful and fearsome, before the backlash came, before Christian Europe organized effective resistance. He had exploited that moment perfectly, achieving fame that would outlast him by centuries. But that moment was passing, and his sons were living through the transition, experiencing both the last great Viking conquests and the beginning of the Viking integration into European civilization. The price of their fame was high, paid not just in blood and treasure, but in other, subtler ways. Ragnar's sons had lived their entire lives in the shadow of their father's reputation, driven to match or exceed his achievements, never quite able to simply be themselves without comparison to the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. They had accomplished extraordinary things, conquered kingdoms, led armies, explored unknown lands, but always the question lingered. Had they done enough? Had they proven themselves worthy of their father's name? The psychological burden of such expectations rarely appears in the sagas, which focus on deeds rather than inner lives, on actions rather than emotions. But it must have been there, that weight of expectation, that need to prove themselves, that fear of being forgotten or dismissed as merely the sons of a great man rather than great men in their own right. They had responded to that burden in different ways, Ivar through political brilliance, Bjorn through adventurous exploration, the others through various paths to power and fame. But all of them were shaped by it, defined by their relationship to Ragnar's legend. The sagas that tell their stories were written centuries after the events, by Christian Icelanders who had their own reasons for remembering these particular Vikings, who shaped the narratives to convey particular messages about fate and family, honor and ambition, the relationship between fathers and sons. How much of what they recorded was historical fact, and how much was later invention is impossible to determine with certainty. But the stories they told became the truth that mattered, the version of events that was passed down through generations, that shaped how people understood the Viking Age and its heroes. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that a Viking leader named Ragnar did exist in the mid-9th century, that he conducted successful raids, including possibly one on Paris, that he died in England, and that his sons led the great heathen army that conquered much of Anglo-Saxon England. Beyond these basic facts, we enter the realm of legend, where historical figures are transformed into archetypal heroes, where events are shaped to convey meaning rather than merely to record what happened. The sagas present Ragnar and his sons as figures of destiny, men whose fates were woven by the Norns before their births, who fulfilled prophecies and lived lives that seemed to follow mythological patterns. Whether the historical Ragnar and his sons saw their lives this way, or whether this interpretive framework was imposed by later storytellers, we cannot know. But the framework itself is revealing, showing what the Norse valued, what they believed about heroes and fate, how they understood the relationship between individual action and larger forces beyond human control. By the early 10th century, less than a century after Ragnar's death, his story was already becoming legend. Skalds were composing poems about him, mixing historical fact with mythological embellishment, creating a narrative that would be told and retold for centuries. The historical Ragnar was disappearing, replaced by the legendary Ragnar, the ideal Viking hero who embodied everything the culture admired: courage and cunning, strength and strategy, fierce loyalty to family, and relentless pursuit of fame. His sons, even as they aged and died, were being incorporated into this legend, becoming not just individuals, but representatives of different aspects of the Viking character. Ivar was the clever one, proving that intelligence mattered as much as strength. Bjorn was the adventurer, embodying the Viking drive to explore and conquer. Ubba was the settler, representing the transition from raider to farmer. Together, they formed a complete picture of Viking possibility, each one showing a different path a Norse man might take, different ways to achieve fame and leave a legacy. The transformation of Ragnar from person to legend accelerated over the following centuries. New stories were added to the corpus, borrowing elements from other legendary figures, attributing to Ragnar deeds that might have been accomplished by entirely different people. The Snake Pit execution, while possibly based on some historical event, took on increasingly dramatic form in the retellings. The relationship with Lagartha, which might have been a brief marriage or even entirely fictional, became a central romantic element. The prophecies and omens that supposedly surrounded his life multiplied with each retelling. By the time the major sagas were written down in Iceland in the 13th century, Ragnar Lothbrok had become a figure comparable to King Arthur or Charlemagne, a semi-mythical hero around whom stories accumulated like pearls forming around a grain of sand. The historical core might still be there, but it was surrounded by so many layers of legend that extracting it with certainty had become impossible. Yet this legendary status was exactly what Ragnar had sought during his life. The historical Ragnar, if we believe the sagas at all, was driven by the desire for fame, for a name that would be remembered, for deeds that would be sung about after his death. In that sense, his life was a spectacular success. He achieved exactly what he wanted, became exactly what he sought to become. The fact that the achievement came at the cost of historical accuracy, that we can no longer be certain what he actually did versus what was attributed to him later, would probably not have troubled him. What mattered was the fame, the remembrance, the immortality of the name. The Viking Age itself was drawing to a close by the 11th century. The last great Viking raid was in 1066, when Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded England and was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Ironically, that same year saw William of Normandy conquer England, and William was himself descended from Vikings, from Rollo, who had been granted Normandy by the French king in exchange for defending against other Vikings. The raiders had become kings. The pagans had converted to Christianity. The outsiders had become insiders. The transformation was complete. But even as the Viking Age ended, the memory of its greatest heroes remained. Ragnar Lothbrok's name continued to be spoken. His story continued to be told. He became a symbol not just of Viking power, but of a particular moment in history. A time when the North was ascendant, when dragon-prowed ships carried warriors to the ends of the known world, when anything seemed possible for men brave enough and clever enough to seize their opportunities. The sagas that preserved his story were written in Iceland, that remote island settled by Norwegian Vikings, where the old traditions and stories were maintained long after they had faded elsewhere. Icelandic scholars collected and recorded the ancient poems, shaped them into coherent narratives, added context and explanation, created the literary tradition that would preserve Norse mythology and history for future generations. Without their work, we would know almost nothing about Ragnar Lothbrok or the Viking Age in general. These saga writers were not historians in the modern sense. They were storytellers, poets, keepers of cultural memory. They shaped their material to entertain and instruct, to convey values and lessons, to celebrate their ancestors and their heritage. The truth they sought was not factual accuracy, but a deeper truth about character and fate, about what it meant to be a hero, about how one should live in order to be remembered. In their hands, Ragnar Lothbrok became more than a man who lived and died in the 9th century. He became an archetype, a pattern, a representation of ideal Viking masculinity. He was brave, but also clever, strong, but also strategic, devoted to family, but also driven by individual ambition, pagan in his beliefs, but facing a Christian world with courage rather than fear. He lived intensely and died dramatically, achieving fame and leaving sons who would carry on his work. He was, in short, exactly the kind of hero the sagas were meant to celebrate. As the centuries passed and the Viking Age receded into history, the story of Ragnar Lothbrok took on new layers of meaning. Each generation that encountered his saga interpreted it through their own concerns and values, finding in his story reflections of their own struggles and aspirations. The legend grew not just in length, but in complexity, becoming a mirror in which people could see themselves and their times. In medieval Iceland, where most of the major Ragnar sagas were composed and preserved, his story spoke to a people trying to understand their own origins. The Icelanders were descendants of Norwegian Vikings who had fled the consolidation of royal power in their homeland, seeking freedom in a harsh but unclaimed land. Ragnar represented the independent spirit that had driven their ancestors, the refusal to bow to authority, the preference for adventure and achievement over security and submission. The saga writers emphasized certain aspects of Ragnar's character that resonated with their own values. His cleverness was celebrated as much as his strength, reflecting Iceland's own emphasis on law and verbal skill. The Icelandic Commonwealth had no king, governing itself through assemblies where disputes were resolved through argument and legal maneuvering as much as through violence. Ragnar's ability to use strategy and wit to achieve his goals made him an ideal hero for such a culture. The relationship between Ragnar and his sons also carried particular significance for the saga audience. Iceland was a society deeply concerned with family loyalty and the obligations between generations. Sons were expected to honor their fathers, to avenge wrongs done to them, to carry forward the family reputation. The way Ragnar's sons united to avenge his death represented the ideal of family solidarity, while their eventual divergence into separate paths reflected the reality that individual ambition sometimes conflicted with family unity. The Christian dimension of the saga is complex and revealing. By the time the sagas were written, Iceland had been Christian for 2 centuries. The saga writers were Christians telling stories about pagans, and they navigated this tension in interesting ways. Ragnar is presented as a pagan, but not as evil or benighted. His courage and honor are recognized and celebrated, even though he worships what the saga writers considered false gods. There is a sense that pagans like Ragnar possessed natural virtue that Christianity would complete rather than contradict. At the same time, the saga includes elements that suggest divine justice or providence operating even in pagan times. Ragnar's death could be read as punishment for pride or for his treatment of his wives. The success of his sons could be seen as God using pagan warriors to punish Christian kingdoms for their own sins. These Christian interpretive layers were added onto older, purely pagan material, creating a complex narrative that worked on multiple levels. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok was not the only story told about him, however. Different versions existed, sometimes contradicting each other in significant ways. The tale of Ragnar's sons focused primarily on the next generation, treating Ragnar's death as the inciting incident rather than the climax. The tale of Ragnar Lothbrok itself had multiple versions, each with slightly different details and emphasis. These variations suggest that there was no single authoritative version, no original text that all others derived from, but rather a tradition of storytelling that allowed for flexibility and creativity. This oral tradition before the written sagas has left only traces in the historical record, but those traces suggest how the story evolved. The oldest reference to Ragnar appears in Irish annals from the 9th century, mentioning a Viking leader whose description might match Ragnar. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records raids and battles that could be connected to Ragnar and his sons, though the names are sometimes different or unclear. Frankish sources describe the attack on Paris in detail, though they do not definitively identify the leader as Ragnar. From these fragmentary historical records, Norse storytellers constructed a narrative, filling in gaps with creative invention, borrowing elements from other stories, shaping the material to conform to their understanding of how heroes should behave and what their lives should mean. The process was similar to how stories about King Arthur or Robin Hood developed, historical kernels elaborated into legend through generations of retelling. One element that appears consistently across different versions is Ragnar's relationship with women. His 3 marriages to Lagartha, Thora, and Aslaug each represent different aspects of feminine power and different challenges to masculine authority. Lagartha is the warrior woman, equal to Ragnar in courage and skill, a partner rather than a subordinate. Thora is the prize won through heroic deed, the traditional reward for defeating monsters. Aslaug is the clever woman of noble birth, who challenges Ragnar with riddles and brings divine heritage to the family line. These women are not passive figures in the saga, but active participants in shaping events. Lagartha rules her own territory after separating from Ragnar. Aslaug's intelligence influences major decisions, and her prophecies guide her sons. Even Thora, who dies young, is remembered as having given Ragnar his first important sons, establishing his dynasty. The saga gives women agency and significance, reflecting perhaps the relatively high status of women in Norse society compared to contemporary Christian Europe. The serpent imagery that runs through Ragnar's story is also worth noting. He gains his nickname from fighting a serpent, defeating it by wearing protective garments. He dies in a pit of serpents, finally vulnerable to the creatures he once defeated. One of his sons bears the mark of a serpent in his eye. These recurring images connect Ragnar's story to deeper mythological patterns, to the great serpent Jörmungandr that encircles the world, to the idea of serpents as symbols of both danger and wisdom. In Norse mythology, serpents occupy an ambiguous position. They are threatening, associated with venom and death, but they are also connected to the earth, to hidden knowledge, to the mysteries that lie beneath the surface of things. Ragnar's relationship with serpents throughout his life might represent his ability to confront and overcome the dangerous and mysterious, to succeed where others would fail through courage and cunning. His final death by serpents could be read as the inevitable triumph of fate, the understanding that even the greatest hero must eventually succumb to forces beyond his control. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and early modern period, interest in Viking history and saga literature declined in most of Europe. The sagas were seen as primitive, barbaric stories of little relevance to more civilized times. Christianity had triumphed, and the pagan past was something to be forgotten or condemned rather than celebrated. The manuscripts containing Ragnar's saga were preserved in Iceland and a few other collections, but they were little read and less studied. It was not until the Romantic movement of the late 18th and 19th centuries that interest in Viking culture revived. Romantic poets and artists were drawn to the wild, untamed qualities of Norse mythology and history, seeing in them an antidote to what they perceived as the over-civilization of their own era. The Vikings represented freedom, adventure, connection to nature, and heroic individualism. Ragnar Lothbrok, with his dramatic life and spectacular death, was exactly the kind of figure that appealed to romantic sensibilities. Scholars began translating the sagas into modern European languages, making them accessible to wider audiences. Artists painted scenes from Viking history and mythology. Poets composed works inspired by Norse themes. The Vikings generally, and Ragnar specifically, were being reinvented for a new age, shaped to address new concerns and embody new values. The historical Ragnar continued to recede further into the distance, while the legendary Ragnar became a canvas on which successive generations could paint their own ideals and anxieties. In Scandinavia, the revival of interest in Viking history took on nationalist overtones. As Norway, Denmark, and Sweden defined themselves as modern nation-states in the 19th century, they looked to the Viking Age as a source of national pride and identity. Ragnar Lothbrok, who had connections to all three countries in various versions of his saga, became a shared ancestor, a symbol of Scandinavian strength and achievement. Statues were erected, books were written. His story was taught to school children as part of their national heritage. This nationalist appropriation of Viking history would have troubling consequences in the 20th century, as various political movements attempted to claim the Vikings for their ideologies. But it also sparked genuine scholarly interest in understanding the Viking Age historically, in separating fact from legend, in reconstructing as accurately as possible what life was actually like in early medieval Scandinavia. Archaeologists began excavating Viking sites, finding evidence of trade networks, settlement patterns, ship construction, and daily life that complicated and enriched the picture provided by the sagas. Through all these reinterpretations and rediscoveries, Ragnar Lothbrok remained a central figure, his name recognized even by people who knew little else about Viking history. He had achieved exactly what he sought, if the sagas are to be believed. His name lived on, remembered across centuries, spoken in languages that did not exist when he lived, by people in lands he never visited. Fame, the immortality of reputation, the survival of the name after the body has turned to dust. These were his goals, and he achieved them more completely than he could have imagined. The scholarly debate about Ragnar Lothbrok's historical reality has continued for centuries, with no definitive resolution in sight. This is partly because the question itself is more complicated than it might initially appear. We are not simply asking whether a man named Ragnar existed in the 9th century, but rather what relationship the legendary Ragnar of the sagas has to any historical individual or individuals who might have inspired the stories. The earliest near-contemporary references are frustratingly vague. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions various Viking raids and leaders, but the names do not always match those in the later sagas, and it is unclear whether different sources are referring to the same people using variant names or describing entirely different individuals. The Irish annals similarly record Viking activity, but without the narrative detail that would allow us to confirm or deny specific saga claims. The attack on Paris in 845 is historical fact, recorded in multiple Frankish sources. A Viking fleet did sail up the Seine, did threaten Paris, and did extract an enormous payment from Charles the Bald. Some Frankish sources name the leader as Reginherus, which could plausibly be a Latinization of Ragnar. However, the sources do not provide enough detail about this Reginherus to confirm that he is the same person as the saga's Ragnar Lothbrok. The name Ragnar was common among Vikings, and multiple men of that name could have led raids during this period. The death in the snake pit presents particular problems. No Anglo-Saxon source contemporary with the events describes such an execution. King Aella of Northumbria is a historical figure, and he did die in 867 when York was taken by the great heathen army. But the circumstances of his death are not clearly recorded in contemporary sources. The snake pit appears first in much later sagas, and some scholars argue it might be a literary invention, borrowed from other execution stories, or misunderstood from poetic descriptions of death. The great heathen army itself is historical, extensively documented in Anglo-Saxon sources. However, these sources do not consistently name the leaders or provide clear information about their relationships to each other. Some chronicles mention sons of Ragnar, but whether this refers to the saga's Ragnar or is simply a common patronymic is unclear. The names given in Anglo-Saxon sources do not always match the names in the sagas, though some correspondences can be identified if we allow for variant spellings and Latinization. One approach to the historical question is to propose that Ragnar Lothbrok is a composite figure, combining elements from several different historical Vikings. There was a Danish leader who raided Paris. There was a Viking leader who died in Northumbria under unclear circumstances. There were multiple sons of various Viking leaders who led the great heathen army. These separate historical facts might have been combined into a single narrative about one man and his sons, creating a story that was emotionally and thematically coherent, even if it was not historically accurate in every detail. This composite theory has appeal because it explains both the historical elements and the inconsistencies in the saga. It suggests that the storytellers were not simply inventing everything, but were working with historical material, shaping and combining it to create a narrative that served their purposes. The result is a story that feels historical, that contains genuine historical events and figures, but that cannot be taken as a reliable historical source in the modern sense. Another possibility is that there was a historical Ragnar whose deeds formed the core of the legend, but that many additional elements were added over time. Stories that originally were about other people were attributed to Ragnar because he was famous, and because attaching stories to a famous name helped preserve them. Details were embellished, dramatic elements were heightened, supernatural or mythological elements were introduced. The result is a legend that has a historical origin, but has been so transformed by the storytelling tradition that recovering the original historical figure is nearly impossible. What we can say with confidence is that the Ragnar of the sagas is a literary creation, a character crafted by skilled storytellers working in a particular tradition with particular goals. This character might be based on a historical person, might incorporate elements from multiple historical people, or might be largely fictional, with only superficial connections to history. The uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship, but a reflection of the nature of the sources and the distance in time between the events and their recording. For the saga writers, this distinction between history and fiction would not have been particularly meaningful. They were not attempting to write history in the modern academic sense, creating an accurate, factual record of past events. They were preserving cultural memory, celebrating ancestral achievements, conveying values and lessons, entertaining their audiences. Whether Ragnar's fight with the serpent was literally true mattered less than what the story revealed about courage and cleverness. Whether the snake pit execution happened exactly as described mattered less than what Ragnar's final words demonstrated about facing death with honor. This does not mean the sagas are worthless as historical sources. They contain valuable information about Viking Age culture, values, social structures, and practices. They reflect how Norse people understood their own history and identity. They preserve poems and traditions that might otherwise have been lost, but they must be used carefully, with awareness of their literary nature, their distance from the events they describe, and the various agendas that shaped their composition. The archaeological record provides some independent evidence about the Viking Age, though it rarely offers direct confirmation or contradiction of specific saga events. We know from archaeology that Viking ships were capable of the voyages described in the sagas. We know that Vikings did establish settlements across the North Atlantic and did conduct raids across Europe. We know details about their weapons, their burial practices, their trade networks. But archaeology cannot tell us whether a specific individual named Ragnar led a specific raid on Paris or died in a specific way in Northumbria. The question of Ragnar's historical reality ultimately matters less than might be assumed. Whether he was one man or many, whether specific details of his life are true or invented, the cultural significance of his legend is undeniable. For centuries, people have told his story, found meaning in it, been inspired by it, used it to understand their own experiences and aspirations. The Ragnar who matters, the Ragnar who has influenced culture and imagination, is the legendary Ragnar, the character in the saga, regardless of his relationship to any 9th century historical figure. Modern popular culture has embraced Ragnar Lothbrok enthusiastically, particularly through television adaptations that have introduced his story to global audiences who might never have encountered the medieval sagas. These modern retellings take significant liberties with the source material, inventing new episodes, creating detailed psychological portraits, adding romantic subplots, reshaping the narrative to suit contemporary tastes and values. They are separated from the historical Ragnar by over 1,000 years, and from the saga Ragnar by the gulf between medieval literature and modern television. Yet these modern adaptations continue a tradition that is itself very old. The saga writers were adapting and reshaping earlier material for their audiences, just as modern screenwriters adapt the sagas for theirs. Each generation reimagines Ragnar, finding in his story elements that speak to contemporary concerns, emphasizing aspects that seem relevant, downplaying or changing elements that seem dated or problematic. The legend is alive precisely because it is flexible, capable of being reinterpreted, reshaped, made new, while retaining core elements that connect it to its origins. What remains constant across all versions, from the earliest fragmentary references through the medieval sagas to modern adaptations, is the basic template. A Viking leader of exceptional ambition and capability, who achieves great things, who dies dramatically, and whose sons carry on his legacy. This core narrative has proven endlessly adaptable, capable of carrying different meanings for different audiences, while remaining recognizably the story of Ragnar Lothbrok. The later histories of Ragnar's sons, after the initial conquest of England and the revenge against Aella, reveal how individual ambitions and personalities shaped their separate destinies. Each brother found his own way forward, and in doing so, each revealed different possibilities for what a Viking warrior king could become in the changing world of the late 9th century. Ivar the Boneless, whose physical condition remains mysterious, proved to be the most politically successful of Ragnar's sons. His rule over York and significant portions of Northumbria and Mercia marked a shift in Viking activity from raiding to state-building. He was not content merely to extract tribute and wealth, but wanted to establish something permanent, a kingdom that would outlast him, that would integrate Vikings and Anglo-Saxons into a new political entity. The historical record suggests that Ivar, or someone matching his description, ruled in York for several years and was regarded as a king in his own right by both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. He minted coins, established laws, negotiated with other kingdoms as an equal. The kingdom he founded would persist in various forms for decades after his death, becoming the core of what would later be called the Danelaw, those parts of England where Danish law and custom prevailed. Ivar's approach to governance was pragmatic and flexible. He recognized that Vikings were a minority in the territories they controlled, and that long-term success required cooperation from the Anglo-Saxon majority. He allowed local nobles to retain their positions if they swore loyalty to him. He seems to have respected Christian churches and monasteries, understanding that the church was a powerful institution that could be a useful ally or dangerous enemy. He married strategically, forming alliances through family connections. This pragmatism sometimes brought Ivar into conflict with more traditionally minded Vikings who saw accommodation with Anglo-Saxons and Christians as weakness or betrayal. But Ivar understood that the world was changing, that the days of pure raiding were ending, that the future belonged to those who could adapt. He was building a hybrid culture, neither purely Viking nor purely Anglo-Saxon, but something new, drawing strengths from both traditions. Bjorn Ironside, by contrast, remained fundamentally a warrior and adventurer. His Mediterranean expedition, whether it happened exactly as the sagas describe or represents a conflation of multiple voyages, demonstrates his refusal to settle, his need for new challenges and new horizons. He was his father's son in the most elemental way, driven by the same hunger for fame and glory, the same restlessness that made staying in one place impossible. The historical evidence for Bjorn is more fragmentary than for Ivar. There are references in Spanish and North African sources to Viking raids in the Mediterranean during this period, and some of these sources mention leaders whose names might correspond to Bjorn. French sources describe Viking raids along the southern coast of France. Italian chronicles record Viking attacks. The cumulative evidence suggests that someone, possibly Bjorn, did lead a Viking force into the Mediterranean and conducted raids there. What Bjorn accomplished in the Mediterranean was remarkable, not just as military achievement, but as navigation and exploration. The Vikings had to sail through waters they did not know, past coastlines they had never seen, dealing with weather patterns and currents entirely different from those they were accustomed to in northern waters. They had to confront Arab pirates and Byzantine warships, opponents with different fighting styles and technologies than they had encountered before. They had to adapt their tactics to a different environment, different types of settlements, different defensive strategies. The sagas tell stories of Bjorn's cleverness in overcoming obstacles, his use of deception and surprise, his willingness to take risks that others would not dare. Whether these specific stories are true is less important than what they reveal about how he was remembered. He was the adventurer, the explorer, the one who pushed boundaries and refused to accept limits. He embodied the Viking Age at its most expansive, when Norse ships ranged from North America to the Middle East, when no sea seemed too distant to cross, no coast too foreign to raid. Ubbe's choice to settle in East Anglia represents a third path, different from both Ivar's state-building and Bjorn's adventuring. Ubbe was transitioning from raider to farmer, from warrior to landowner, from Viking to what would eventually become an English nobleman of Danish descent. It was a practical choice, recognizing that the rewards of settlement could be more stable and ultimately more valuable than the rewards of constant warfare. The treaty between Ubbe and the Kingdom of Wessex that allowed this settlement was historically significant. It represented a recognition by both sides that peaceful coexistence was possible, that Vikings could be integrated into English society rather than remaining permanent enemies. The Vikings would keep their own laws and customs in the regions they controlled, but they would acknowledge Wessex's supremacy and pay tribute. In exchange, they received legitimate title to land and the protection of peace. This settlement pattern would be repeated across the Danelaw as more and more Vikings chose farming over raiding, land over plunder. Archaeological evidence shows extensive Viking settlement in parts of England, with distinctly Scandinavian artifacts and building styles appearing alongside Anglo-Saxon ones. Place names of Scandinavian origin dot the map of northern and eastern England, marking villages founded by Viking settlers. The genetic legacy can still be detected in modern populations, evidence of the intermarriage between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons that created a blended culture. The younger brothers, Hvitserk and Sigurd, left less distinct marks on history, at least in the records that survive. Hvitserk's story becomes confused in the sagas, merging with other figures, suggesting that he may not have achieved the individual fame of his brothers. He was a warrior, certainly, participating in various campaigns, but he seems not to have carved out his own kingdom or led his own major expeditions. Sigurd Snake in the Eye inherited portions of his father's original kingdom in Denmark and ruled there until his death. He was a competent king, maintaining what his father had built rather than dramatically expanding it. His descendants would continue to rule in parts of Scandinavia for generations, carrying forward the bloodline. But Sigurd himself didn't achieve the legendary status of Ivar or Bjorn. He was successful, but not exceptional, important, but not transformative. The diverging paths of Ragnar's sons illustrate a larger truth about the Viking Age in its later phases. There was no single model for success, no one way to be a Viking leader. Ivar showed that political acumen and state-building could be as valuable as martial prowess. Bjorn demonstrated that there were still opportunities for the traditional Viking virtues of daring and exploration. Ubbe proved that settlement and integration could provide security and prosperity. Each brother found his own version of success, adapted to his own strengths and circumstances. Yet all of them remained, in important ways, Ragnar's sons. They defined themselves in relation to their father, either continuing his work or departing from it, but always conscious of his shadow, his reputation, his expectations. They had avenged him spectacularly, conquering the kingdom where he died, and in doing so had proven themselves worthy of his name. But that very success created new questions about what came next, about how to build on such an achievement, about whether they could ever step fully out of his shadow and become known for their own accomplishments rather than as extensions of his legacy. The family relationships between the brothers, which had been close during their youth and united during the invasion of England, grew more distant as they aged and pursued their separate paths. Years might pass without them seeing each other. They had their own courts, their own advisors, their own families. The bond of brotherhood remained, but it was attenuated by distance and diverging interests. They were no longer a unified force, but separate leaders whose goals sometimes aligned and sometimes conflicted. When Ivar died, probably in the early 870s, it marked the end of an era. He had been the strategic leader, the one who unified and directed the great heathen army, the one who had transformed revenge into conquest and conquest into kingdom building. His death left a vacancy that no one else could quite fill. The Viking presence in England continued, but it became more fragmented, more localized, less coordinated. The age of the great armies gave way to an age of individual jarls and petty kings, each ruling their own territory, sometimes cooperating, but often competing. Bjorn's death, perhaps a decade later, removed another link to the heroic age. With him went the last of the great adventurers, the last leader who could inspire warriors to follow him on voyages into unknown waters. The Vikings continued to raid and explore, but the great expeditions, the kind that reached the Mediterranean or discovered Iceland, became less common. The energy that had driven the early Viking Age was dissipating, absorbed into the work of settlement and integration, channeled into more mundane, but ultimately more lasting achievements. By the end of the 9th century, Ragnar's sons were all dead or dying. The generation that had avenged him, conquered England, and established Viking kingdoms across the north was passing. Their own children and grandchildren were inheriting power, and these younger generations had never known the purely Viking world their grandfathers had come from. As they were born in England or Ireland, grew up speaking multiple languages, navigated between cultures. They were something new, hybrid identities that would eventually evolve into the English, the Irish, the Normans. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons was becoming history, then legend, then myth. The transformation was already underway as living memory faded and was replaced by stories, as facts blurred and were reshaped by the storytelling tradition, as the messiness of real lives was simplified into narrative patterns that served the needs of later audiences. The men who had lived were becoming the characters who would be remembered, and those characters would be shaped as much by the imaginations of saga writers as by the historical realities of their lives.